What's going on, everyone? I'm Jeff St. Pierre, and this is episode 170 of the Adult Education Podcast. Today, I'm speaking with professor, researcher, and author Scott D. Anthony. You've probably heard the big mantra that's come out of Silicon Valley: move fast and break things. It's kind of the credo of the so-called disruptor. So what's a disruptor? The definition is a person or thing that interrupts an event, activity, or process by causing a disturbance or problem. Now, it takes someone who's not afraid to cause a problem in order to try new things and hopefully find some kind of breakthrough. While we think of the term disruptor in more current terminology, disruptors have been around forever. I mean, the first person to use fire, to use the wheel, you get the idea. We live in a world where so many things have been available to us, like the book, for example. They've always been around, but there was a time before the printing press. Being able to replicate books, that was an epic change to the world. Scott D. Anthony is a clinical professor of strategy at the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth College. He's been studying disruptive change. Scott studies the things that are changing the world and helps people navigate those changes in a way that will help them thrive. Last fall, he published his latest book called Epic Disruptions: 11 Innovations That Shaped Our Modern World. Now, this conversation stretches back hundreds of years to the printing press and gunpowder, then to more recent innovations like the disposable diaper or the iPhone. We're going to chat about some of these disruptions and the impacts they had on society, but you'll also hear us discuss the downside to disruptions. I'm not a hater or anything, but I do recognize that not all disruptions are good for us. Sometimes the innovators don't think about the negative consequences that come with their innovations. Scott's great. You can tell he speaks for a living. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope that you do too. Hey, Scott.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I am just happy that the technology works. I tell you, I've been bouncing from platform to platform since the book launched, and every time it's a little different and something doesn't quite work, but today it's all cooperating.
Well, that's great news. It's funny. We've been doing this since, 2020 when the pandemic struck, and we're still trying to figure this thing out after all this time.
I was just on a Teams call, and the person was going for at least 3 minutes. We're all like, you are on mute, but they just kept going and going.
Well, Scott, it's great to talk to you, man. I'm very excited to talk about this book and disruptive innovations. And I think it's fitting that we started the conversation this way, talking about the technology that we're using for this, because I feel like even this is going down a rabbit hole I didn't necessarily plan, but even this was something that I don't think a lot of us expected to become so integral to our daily lives today, like the video chatting and the conferencing this way.
Well, I just, in the interest of experiencing new technologies, I just took the plunge and got the Apple Vision Pro over the weekend. And my wife received the first FaceTime with me as an avatar, and she's like, "What the hell is this?" She's like, "Please don't do that again." But my 20-year-old son has been enjoying it a lot, the basketball and some of the immersive movies and all that. And you just, the technology's not there yet, but you see the direction of travel, and you say, "Wow, this is really going to change a bunch of things."
Whenever we talk about, disruptive innovation or disruptors or anything, I always think back to that Jurassic Park quote, which I'm sure you've heard before. It's they got so hung up on whether they could or whether they could or not, but they didn't stop to think if they should. I know I'm butchering the quote right now. And I always think back to that when it comes to disruptors, because sometimes there are things that come out that I'm like, okay, yeah, this is cool, but like, did this take us into a place that maybe isn't going to be as beneficial for us in the long run?
I remember a few years ago, I was at a conference in Australia, and I had Charlie, the 20-year-old who was playing around with the Apple Vision Pro, do a drawing of how he thought about technology. He was probably 8 or 9 at the time. And he drew something really dystopian. And I said, let's think about that. You say, well, a lot of what at the time was kind of cutting edge social media has upsides, but also feeds into, we now know, some really, really dark things. And there's this whole complex, I call it the advertising narcissism complex, that exists that doesn't make anyone better in any material way and leads to lots and lots of bad things. So yeah, there's a shadow, always is.
So let's talk about the book here. The book is called Epic Disruptions: 11 Innovations That Shaped Our Modern World. And just talking about what you just referenced there, the last chapter, or the second to last chapter, is about the iPhone. And that's kind of where you stopped, because there's still so much changing and things change so rapidly today that you really have to kind of pick a stopping point when you do a book like this. But the iPhone, we look at it and we think, wow, what an amazing invention to put all of this power in our hands, access to everything that we could possibly even want. But at the same time, does that make us better? Like, or has it, like you just talked about with social media? I think we've all seen, like, yeah, social media can be fun and we can have a good time with it, but it's also led to so many things that are probably on the downside of things. Is the iPhone, is the smartphone, is that something that we're going to look back on history and go, wow, what an incredible invention that we had?
I think without a doubt, there will be a yes and there'll be a but. So
Yeah.
an incredible invention that transformed lots of things. And but might we have thought differently about the way that we handled it societally? And I go back to the 1920s. In the book, I talk about the rise of the Model T in the modern automotive age. And to get through the middle part of that required some work because it was messy in the middle. Cities were built for not cars, but people and horses. So there's chaos and carnage, sadly, on the streets. To get through it, there's technology like traffic lights, there's norms like when we get to an intersection, who goes first, and there's regulation. There are driver's license, speed limits, and so on. We kind of, I think, forgot those lessons from history where we said, hey, let's just let the companies work it out and it's all going to be fine. We did that with social media. It was not all fine. We're doing it again with artificial intelligence. It's not all fine. I think we have forgotten some important lessons from history, and hopefully we'll remember them before it's too late. Not to be too doomsayer about it,
No.
but I think there's some bad things happening, and we can do better. I think.
Yeah, regulation has become kind of a dirty word in society. No, nobody likes regulation anymore, and I get that. Like there are some things where you're like, okay, maybe that's a little bit too much, but at the same time, as you just mentioned, some of these inventions we look at over history, regulation is what made it work for us. Regulation is what made it easily and accessible for us to use this thing. So I do think there has to be a balance, and we don't seem to be finding that balance anymore.
I agree. My life can be pretty well summarized by I'm the middle child of two psychiatrists. So, that explains a lot about me. But, as a middle child, what I never like is extremes. You always look for something where you say, where can you find the healthy balance and the positivity and the tension? And I think regulation is one of those. Obviously, too much is bad. And no doubt it stifles innovation, growth, and so on. Too little is bad too.
Mhm.
The right amount where you say, hey, we're putting some boundaries around things. We might have some flexibility in those boundaries. Bob Johansen, the futurist, says we need bounce ropes, not guardrails, where like a wrestling ring, you can actually use them in some ways. But we still need to have something that says, here's the edge and here's what we just will not allow. And again, I think the extremes are just bad. They're dangerous. In history, it's a lesson, unfortunately, we have to keep learning.
We've had the automobile now for over 100 years, and Boston still hasn't seemed to figure out the city planning for that yet. I know you're a New Englander. I grew up just north of Boston myself, and I just remember driving or trying to drive around Boston in my younger years, being like, what is going on here? How do we get around? So maybe we have to work on that city, too, on how to get them to figure out the automobile still.
I'm just smiling. My son just texted. He goes to Boston University, and he was driving in to go to a class today. He's usually on campus, but he was at home for whatever reason. And he said, "There's no parking around here." I'm like, "Wow, that's a surprise. Who could see that one coming?" But anyway, kids have to learn when they learn.
Talk to me a little bit about the idea for this book and define disruptive innovation for me.
So let me do the definition first and then the book. So the way I like to define it is a quick trip through history. So 1947, my father was born. At the time, there is exactly one, count them, one computer in the world. It weighed 20 tons, centralized. He would never touch it. I was born in 1975. Now you've got tens of thousands of computers. They're still big, they're still expensive, they're still complicated. I wouldn't see those types of computers because they're in large corporations. 2007, the year my daughter Holly is born, there are now hundreds of millions of computers, desktops, and laptops. And of course, we mentioned it already. That's the year Steve Jobs and team
Mhm.
introduced the first version of the iPhone. Now you have billions of devices in your palm and in your pocket. That's disruptive innovation. Take things that were complicated and expensive, make them simple and affordable, change market dynamics, drive explosive growth. Why this book? Well, it actually was not my idea. It was the idea of the publisher. I had a different book that I proposed to them. And they said, we just named disruptive innovation one of the four most influential ideas in business history. You spent your life thinking about it. What about a very different book where you investigate disruption through history? And at first I said, I'm not a historian. This is not the book I actually want to write. But then I kind of got obsessed and I couldn't stop thinking about it. So I said, why not? And I am so glad I did because the lesson I learned is that history gives you a really unique lens It gives you timeless stories that give you fiercely urgent messages for all of the disruptions that are taking place today, because there are a lot of them.
One of the things you talk about in the book too is how companies, when they were trying to innovate, they were trying to make changes, they were often catering to their biggest clients because that's how they figured they were going to make money. Those people are spending more money, but in the process, they sort of left some folks behind. It didn't always work out well. So disruption doesn't always, we think of the term disruptors, I think, at least in this day and age, as something that like, oh, they're disruptors. They're doing something big. They're making big things happen. But disruption does not always equal success.
No, absolutely right, Jeff. And also, as you noted, a disruptive innovation, the way that it's used in the book, which traces back to the original research done by my mentor, teacher, colleague, co author, friend, the late, great Clayton Christensen. The research and the term in that use specifically looks at those that play the innovation game differently, not doing it better along traditional dimensions, but introducing new benefits around simplicity, affordability, and accessibility. Because what Clay identified in his research is a trap for the large organization. You do what you're supposed to do, which is listen to your best, most demanding customers who tell you, please do what you're currently doing, make it better, make it faster, make it a little bit cheaper. And then someone comes in and changes the paradigm by playing the game completely differently. His first book was called The Innovator's Dilemma because his research showed that doing what felt right, listening to the best, innovating to meet their needs, producing the best products was actually a recipe for disaster when the industry changed. And the disruptor does it differently and realizes the benefits from it.
Yeah, it's also not often the person who sees success with something is not often the first person to find that as well. You see that somebody makes a discovery, and then other people kind of tweak it, and now all of a sudden, here you go, you've got this brand new product that is going to run away with things, which I thought was kind of interesting too. The people that maybe had the original idea are not the ones that necessarily get the credit, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Oh, for sure. And you can go back. We talked very briefly about the automobile. Henry Ford was not the first person to create an automobile. He it was really 30 years after the pioneering work was done that the first Model T came out in 1908. What Henry Ford did uniquely was say, how do we make this technology accessible and affordable to a broader population? And that didn't happen overnight. 1908, when the first Model T came out, it cost $30,000 in today's terms. It took the assembly line, new ways to orient the workforce, and a lot of work before it got down to a price where larger populations could actually afford it. So you've got decades of pioneering work that is done to get the fundamental technologies in place. And then the singular innovative force of Henry Ford to say, all right, how do we put these pieces together and really create a business and operating model that allows the world to benefit from this idea? And that story repeats in just about anything you look at.
$30,000 for a vehicle actually sounds like a deal these days. So
Relatively speaking, you have to go back to 1908 when the country was a lot poorer
yes.
than it is now, and ultimately got it down to $5,000 in today's terms, which that sounds like a real steal today.
There was a Hyundai. I forget what the type of car was, but when I was in high school in the mid to late '90s, there was a Hyundai that was selling for $7,500 brand new, and I almost bought. I ended up buying a used car instead for a little bit cheaper. But I just think back, like the fact that I could have bought a brand new vehicle for $7,500 in my lifetime is fascinating because I think we just passed the time where there's not a single vehicle available under $20,000 now. That is like the lowest that you will be able to find it, which is kind of fascinating. You would think that things have gotten easier to build and even more economical, but yet they're just getting more and more expensive at the same time.
Well, and this is a little bit of what we're talking about the innovator's dilemma. Why is that happening? Because more and more features and functions are being packed into automobiles. And the theory then predicts someone's going to come in and change the paradigm. And you could argue we don't really fully see this yet in the United States. But if you go to Europe, Africa, many other places, this is what the Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers have done, fundamentally rethink what a car looks like. It's not a car, but it's a mobile phone on wheels that is a connected device. and use economies of scale like the world can't believe to drive the prices down.
I was actually in Spain over the summer. My family took a trip to Spain and we were in Sevilla, Spain, and there was some sort of global summit happening there at the time. And we saw all of these black, really sharp looking black electric vehicles. And I think it was BYD, I think was the company. And I was like, I feel like I've heard about this car. It's supposed to be the really cheap, affordable car, but all these dignitaries were driving them or they were being driven around in them, which I thought was really interesting because these cars, I think are very affordable. We can't get them here in the United States right now because of whatever situation is going on, but they're very affordable cars. And I was like, these are rich people that should not be driving in cars like this.
But BYD, and one of the things that it and Huawei and a number of the other manufacturers done is just really again rethink everything, rethink production, rethink marketing, rethink the way that you promote. And it really is driving huge changes. Again, we don't see it here in the United States, but you look at the global automobile space and it's a really different world. And it was hard enough for the Detroit auto manufacturers to begin with, but you throw this on top of it, and boy, it's just a tough world for them right now.
Yeah, I don't want to keep going down this road here, but I just think it's
I
interesting.
like the pun. Yeah, we'll go down the road as long as the
Thank you.
electric vehicle.
Thank you. I think it's interesting because Detroit has always been this thing that we've held so high, right? The Detroit automakers, we've held this so high. They've created such amazing vehicles over the years and in their history. But there is this element of like, why haven't they been able to cross that line? Like, why haven't they been able to keep up with some of the innovations from other parts of the world? You would think they're top tier, they're top notch. Why do we still feel like maybe we're behind?
I would say it comes down to two things, really. One, there still is a lot of money to be made selling luxury SUVs and pickup trucks and so on. So the same thing that we talked about as the core of the innovator's dilemma holds very true. You don't feel as much of a sense of crisis because there are portions of the business that are still extremely successful. That's one thing. And second, change is really hard. Organizations have identities. The Detroit auto manufacturers, the ones you see in German as well, they are mechanical engineers at their core, at their heart. They have a way that they've worked for decades, in some cases more than a century. When you try and say, throw all of that away and do something really different, conceptually it makes sense, but I call them ghosts. You are haunted by the ghosts of the past where you've had other change efforts that haven't worked, or you've got invisible patterns that you don't realize you're following, or your people actually are scared. They're scared of that period where they don't know, they have to unlearn, they have to look foolish, and they have to leave yesterday's identity, which they like a lot, behind. So I've got a lot of empathy because this is an incredibly hard problem to solve. Not unsolvable. People have shown you can do it, but it is so deep that solving it requires unbelievably hard work from leadership.
I'm glad you mentioned that, the whole change is hard idea, because you reference this in the book at least a couple times where you talk about companies that didn't see the change coming. There's one point that you reference Nokia, and I think there was an advertisement that came out right around the same time the iPhone launched where they were like, why would we change anything? We're winning. I forget the exact quote, but then you look back and like, boy, that quote did not age well. That did not turn out great for them. Or you reference the newspaper industry because they were like, well, we've got feet on the street. Like we've got people that are out there doing, like, why would we have to change? And now how's that industry doing? And it's interesting that people don't always have that foresight because they're so locked into, well, we're winning. We shouldn't have to think about who's coming up behind us.
Oh, for sure. This is something I teach students in the class that I teach up at the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth College, class session number 1. I said, you have to recognize that you will face as a leader something that I call the information action paradox, a bit of a mouthful, but the idea is pretty simple. By the time the data are clear, it's too late to take action based on the implications of that data. So if you want to be what we aspire our students to be, a wise, decisive leader that betters the world through business, you have to wait for it, act when the data tells you not to. That's not to say you ignore data, of course, but you got to go and sense the weak signal and have the wisdom to say, hey, history teaches me, a good model or theory teaches me that this suggests if I don't act now, by the time it's clear, it's too late to do anything. And a lot of tools that you can use to do it, but it's not intuitive. Intuitively, you look to see what's our market share, what's our stock price, what are our customers saying, and all those look good until they don't. It's the Ernest Hemingway line, how did you go bankrupt? First slowly and then suddenly. And that's what disruption is like, first slowly and then suddenly.
Yeah, I think about that in my industry. I spent the last 20 to 25 years in professional radio broadcasting, and it's still there and it's still doing well, but it's not what it used to be. Much like other industries like newspapers, magazines, and everything. I mean, it still exists, but no one in the industry, despite the conversations, really wants to think about what things like Spotify or Apple Music or even YouTube are doing to the industry. They still sit there and they still think like, oh, well, we're fine. I mean, ABC, NBC, CBS, they still exist, even though cable's around. We're going to be fine. But I think you're a management guy, and I think this is a lack in management or a lack in leadership that we have today, where no one wants to think about that other aspect. They just think we're good. We're fine sitting in our tower. We don't have to worry about what's coming up behind us.
And I get it. I get it, Jeff,
I do
because
too. Yeah, but
think
still.
about it, it's hard and it's painful, and it means you're gonna have to shrink before you're gonna grow, and you might never recover to the same size and stature that you were before. So, we have great defense mechanisms as humans to help us get through every day. And to some degree, those blind spots are just a very natural way to say, everything's okay. Let's not talk about the gambling that's going, whatever. That's a way that we get through the day. Now, of course, the problem is you follow that for too long, you actually create something that you can't break out of. You're hastening your own destruction without you being aware of it. 'Cause, you look at it the right way, the media business, obviously, it's been hard for large organized media of traditional means in the last couple decades. But on the flip side, you see a growth industry. You have many more people that are creating many more forms of content, distributing it in new ways, making money in new ways. There has been a huge amount of democratization that's been very good for some people. And of course, some of the platforms on which some of these things go. So, as always, when disruption strikes, there are opportunities, and you try to cling to the past. It feels natural and safe until it doesn't.
Let's get back into the book here a little bit, because we've gotten a little sidetracked. We're not going to talk about every single disruption that you bring up in here, but I did think the Florence Nightingale chapter was really interesting. And one of the things you describe her as is kind of like the first social media star of sorts, which I thought was a really interesting take, and I'd never thought of it from that perspective. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so the very brief version of the Florence Nightingale story. She's born in 1820 in Florence, Italy, of course. She gets a call from God, she says, in her teens to become a nurse, to go into a life of service. Her parents are not happy about that call because at the time, nursing is a lower class profession. But Florence persists, and she gets trained in modern day Germany, and then ultimately goes to the battlefield during the Crimean War. And she's there with a team of nurses to go and help in hospitals, a very dire situation. She gets there and she quickly telegraphs back to London, we've got a problem, because she learns that the worst place to be is not on the battlefield, which is plenty bad, but it's in the hospital.
Mm.
There's open sewage, there isn't clean air, there isn't clean light, and people are dying of preventable infectious diseases. So she gets a team from London to come in, they clean up the hospitals. The Telegraph, that's an important part of the story. This is the first major conflict after the advent of the telegraph, which meant people could have real time updates from the front line, which was impossible before. So, this idea that there was this nurse, this kind person who's going around with a lamp administering to patients in these dire conditions, captures the idea or the eyes of a journalist. He writes about the lady with the lamp, and it just catches fire. People begin naming their children Florence. All this money comes in to support her, which she ultimately goes to use to open up a line of teaching hospitals to allow more people to practice the kind of nursing she talks about. So I love the story because it shows the persistence. She had to overcome obstacles to do what she did. It shows that social media is not a new phenomenon, it's existed for a long time. And it shows you as you go through it what disruption in healthcare looks like. Because what she did at the hospital was go from going to worry about treatment to how do you prevent infectious diseases. When she went back to England, she was part of a royal commission that did an entire report that used data visualization to show the nature of the problem and how good hygiene could solve it. That led to her writing books that explained the principles of nursing, the teaching hospitals, and ultimately public reform that put in place many of the modern hygiene standards that we take for granted today. So, showing that by moving from treatment to prevention, people live longer, happier, healthy lives. I think it's a great story. And the data visuals are super cool too.
Yeah, the fact that you still have access to all those, I think, is amazing. And I also liked, I didn't know this part of the story, not that I'm an expert on Florence Nightingale, but I didn't realize she was one of the first to take a look at the soldiers that were coming back from war were dying at much younger rates than other people who did not go. And that was kind of an interesting thing. We know that now. People that come back, they struggle. They have PTSD. They have other things that they develop when they've been out on the battlefield. But they didn't think about that back then. And Florence was one of the first people to really start to talk about that and go, why are these young men dying so much earlier than other people?
And she did not do that work alone. And I think it's another
Sure.
important thing to highlight. So, she teamed up with William Farr, who was in the General Registry Office that's tracking birth, deaths, and so on, used an early tabulating machine that is a progenitor of the computers we were talking about before. So, really did some great collaborative work, did some great data analysis, and then visualized it in ways that had huge impact. So, the curious mind asking questions about what am I seeing here? The collaborator who would go and find different people to work with who could then portray it in ways that normal people could understand. These are all behaviors that any good innovator should follow: the curiosity, the customer obsession to imagine how people process information, collaboration, trying bunches of different things. And you see in Florence Nightingale the kind of impact you can have when you do it. Again, it's a super powerful story. And I knew none of that. When I started researching the chapter, it was almost random walking. I'm just like, Florence Nightingale, I think she did something interesting. Let's go and then, like anything, you go a couple levels deeper and the world just has all of these fascinating stories that have different facets to them.
I think about stories like Florence Nightingale's as an example, from my youth growing up. Like, we heard that name in classes and in history, but there's so much history you're trying to cover in a tiny window when you're in school. You can't spend 2 months on Florence Nightingale, though she probably deserves it. Like, all those things that she was a part of with her collaborators are pretty amazing things, but there's still a lot of other history that we have to cover. So we do kind of have to brush over some folks, I guess, when you get to that point.
Leaves room for people like me to write about it and create ways to amplify and spread those stories. And, hopefully in the background, help people today who are saying, okay, we've got lots of healthcare related issues as populations age and we think about the diseases of the aged. What can we learn from the 1850s and 60s that can help us think about it? And I think there are some really important lessons that we can pull forward. System change requires a systematic approach. And that's what Florence Nightingale did. You need the data, you need the visualization, you need to have the teaching, you need to have the training. And we kind of forget these things, but they're very applicable with the issues that we face today, I think.
I don't know if a lot of folks would necessarily think of Julia Child as being a disruptive innovator, but for real, I mean, this woman did change the game in so many different ways. I found that chapter to be really fascinating, and just learning more about her and how she sort of accidentally got into so much of this. And so it changed everything.
It is my favorite chapter. It is the chapter that my kids like to joke about the most because they cannot believe the opening to the chapter made it through the editing process. It opens by saying it started out with a kiss. I say, no, 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 that's a killer song. But it started out with a fish. And the kids say the editors let that go. And I'm like, it's great. It's a great opening. They said, such a dad joke. But anyway, the Julia Child story, I love it because you don't see it coming. And you say, Julia Child, what did she disrupt? Well, if you go back to the 1950s, if you lived in America, if you wanted to enjoy great French food, what did you do? You had to get in a plane or a boat and go to France.
Sure.
Julia Child, through Mastering the Art of French Cooking, made it simple and accessible for a broader population too. Classic disruptive innovation. She also shows that people are not born as great disruptive innovators. She was not born a great chef. Nobody is. She was actually a pretty bad chef when she was growing up. First meal she cooked for her husband, Paul Child, was brains simmered in red wine sauce. Apparently, it was as bad as it sounds. She failed the exam in Le Cordon Bleu the first time she took it. Through hard work and support from husband, friends, and a bunch of other people, she ultimately became great, but it didn't happen overnight. And her story, the more you go into it, you see the same patterns that you see in Florence Nightingale. There's the curiosity, the collaboration, the customer focus, the persistence. 1951 is when she met Simca Beck and Louisette Berthold, the two co-authors of Mastering the Art of French Cooking. They had a contract to publish a book in 1954. The book came out 7 years after that, after two publisher switches and one near-death experience. It's true for any innovation success. It's never a straight line. There's always the false steps, fumbles, and failures. And Julia Child illustrates that about as well as anyone.
The TV aspect of Julia Child too, I thought was really interesting. And I grew up in New England, so WGBH was something that was burnt into my brain as a child. That's what was our public TV, and Sesame Street, everything was on WGBH. And they took a chance. They were like, "Here's this woman that's doing something kind of interesting. She herself is an interesting character. Let's try this and see if a cooking show would be really good." That's just really like, I don't know, like all the stars seem to align for her in a lot of ways that way.
I agree. I think one of the things that's interesting that I didn't note this in the book, somebody asked me, what did you learn about the book after you wrote the book? And I got a call from AARP saying, you want to do something to promote the book. I'm like, of course, I do a story for you all. They said, is anyone in the book older than 50? I'm like, I hadn't thought about that. And naturally, you go to Julia Child, and she debuted on television when she was 50. And then you go to the other stories, you're like, every single story has a protagonist that is in their fifth or sixth decade when something important happens. So Ray Kroc, he's a milkshake salesperson. He hears about this fast growing restaurant in San Bernardino, California. He goes to visit it. He leaves with the deal to become its master franchisor. This, of course, is McDonald's. He was 52 at the time. Even Johannes Gutenberg, he was 54 to 57, depending on when you count his date of birth, when the first Bible rolled off the printing press. And this is in the 15th century. So I hadn't thought about that before. And having just turned 50 this year, maybe this is self serving. But I think you can make an argument that along some dimensions, disruption begins at 50. The research shows while your fluid intelligence declines as you get older, your crystal intelligence, the ability to see patterns and have wisdom and so on, that can keep going up until you're in your 70s or 80s. And the ability to say, like Ray Kroc, I see something here. There's something that maybe other people are missing. I can put this into context. I can combine things together. You can argue that's a key component of the disruptive innovator. The Apple iPhone came out in 2007. Steve Jobs was 52 that year. So I don't know. There might be something in that thought.
No, there is something there, because I wonder, we think of disruptors now, especially because tech world, I think, encompasses most of the disruption conversation these days. And we think of these young people, that have found a way to get investors to create something different with coding and whatever. We think of the picture of the young male in Silicon Valley. But there is something to be said about wisdom that you gain with age, and I'm 44 years old, almost 45. So I guess I'm kind of getting close to that point too. But as you age, you kind of see the world through different eyes, and you understand maybe like you just said, Ray Kroc was like, people are missing something. There's something that other folks are not paying attention to here. When you're 22, you're not necessarily looking from the world in that perspective. So I think there might be something with that age thing.
And one of the greatest thought experiments that we will never know the answer to, I mentioned in the book how Kodak, everyone says it completely missed digital imaging. Totally not true. Invested in the technology, had good digital cameras. Everyone says it completely missed the move towards photo sharing. Completely not true. It bought Ophoto in 2000, 4 years before Mark Zuckerberg wrote a line of code. So they had a photo sharing site. They could have, in one world, made it easy for people to share photos, news updates, and so on. Lo and behold, Eastman Kodak, at the time, a very large, well-respected company, has social media. The thought experiment. What does our world look like if social media is run by smart companies that think in a nuanced way about upsides, downsides, and controls for the things they do versus people who just unleashed it on the world? We will never know, but I suspect it would be a better, not worse world. Of course, that's not what Eastman Kodak did. It made it harder, not easier to share pictures. It tried to force people to print images because that's what its business
Yeah.
was, it thought at least. And we know how that story ended, not positively for the company.
Yeah, unfortunately. There's a lot in this book, a lot of really cool anecdotes. I really enjoyed learning more about these different things over time. You have 11 epic disruptions in here. We covered a couple of them here in this conversation. But in the last chapter, you talk about where do we go from here? Because as we mentioned, it just seems like the world is changing at a rapid rate right now. But there's a quote in that last chapter right near the beginning, and I forget, I didn't make a note of who says it, but it says, "I must say I am a bit fed up of living in unprecedented times. I'd like to live in precedented times for a couple of years." Boy, doesn't that sound like what most of us are echoing right now in our life? Can't we just live in a normal world for a little bit? Like, I don't want to be disrupted today.
It was the former CEO of Unilever who said that, and a few months later was relieved of his job. for better or worse, that's the way the world is. And look, Jeff, I'm an optimist by nature. I learned through the research in the book, even more starkly, that disruption has a downside to it. There's a shadow to it. It can be painful. It causes loss. It can tear apart parts of society. So no doubt there's a downside. And there also is tremendous potential, tremendous upside when you're taking things that once were constrained and opening them up and creating new possibilities and pushing new frontiers. So, in my view, yes, I totally get that sense. Sometimes it feels like too much. It got 4 kids, and you really can feel that all the time. And then you say, but we can do these amazing, wonderful things. We've got these technologies that allow us to connect and share in completely different ways. And yes, some of our institutions are being torn down, and that's scary. New, better ones can be built in their wake, and that's really up to us. It was the one CEO before the CEO of Unilever. Paul Pullman is the not in the book. He was it was his successor that had that quote. But Paul Pullman, I saw him speak a couple months ago. He was talking about climate change, which in many parts of the world is in retreat. The idea that we're going to fight against climate change, and Paul Pullman said we have to keep fighting because no story ever ended with the hero saying, "And now I give up." That's just not the way it works, and we have to now say, "Okay, what's next?" With a smile, I think.
Of course. Yeah. Yeah. I'm not a hater. I mean, I do see the value in so much of this. But as we talked about earlier in this conversation, you also have to acknowledge the other aspects that come along with it. You can't just throw it out there in the world. You have to understand, okay, well, how is this going to work? How do we navigate this to make this an important thing? So I do think there's a lot of great stuff to come. And Scott, I do appreciate your time today to talk about this and the book. I know you mentioned in the book, it's not a history book per se. It's a jaunt through history to take a look at these different things, but there's so many things that I didn't know about these inventions that we all know so well, like McDonald's, the printing press, gunpowder, so many things that I did not know and I was not aware of. So I appreciate you putting it together. Again, the book is called Epic Disruptions, 11 Innovations That Shaped Our Modern World. Scott, if people want to find out more about you or follow along with what's going on here, where's the best place to go?
2 places. So there is a companion website, epicdisruptions.com with an S, it is plural. And then I live my social media life on LinkedIn. So you have to look for Scott Anthony Tuck because there's another Scott Anthony that also has written a book about how you can grow the sales of your pizza business. I cannot help you with that. I can help you with disruptive change. Scott Anthony Tuck is the easiest way to find me.
I did find that other Scott when I'm like, these don't feel like the same Scott when I was doing my research. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
There's also one who is a magician who's out there.
Okay.
Scott, whenever you meet a Scott, you know roughly where they're from because the name peaked right around when I was born, but it's plus or minus 7 years. So you know exactly their vintage. But there are a few of us. I'm Scott D. Anthony in Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth College. We should get all of us together sometime and just have some fun making pizza and doing magic tricks and talking about disruptive change.
There's that thing in Texas they try to do every year. I think it's Kyle, Texas. They try to get the largest gathering of Kyles. Anybody named Kyle, they want to come to. They keep missing the Guinness Book of Records by a few people every year. But if we got to do it for Scott Anthony's, we'll have a big gathering of Scott Anthony's.
That sounds like a blast. I would be there with bells on.
Well, thank you so much again, Scott, for your time. I appreciate you.
Jeff, it's been great. Thank you.
Another thank you to Scott D. Anthony. His book, Epic Disruptions, 11 Innovations That Shaped Our Modern World, is available now. I really enjoyed it. While Scott will say he's not a historian, he does a great job taking us back in time and sharing the behind-the-scenes stories to some of the moments in history that we've all heard about. So big thank you to all of you as well for listening. I appreciate your time. Until next time, be well.